Well, good evening, everyone, and good evening, General.
Thank you, Matthew.
You have written, I won't necessarily say an optimistic book, but certainly a positive book about America and America's potential role in the world, which, as was said, is an incredibly timely book, given, I think, a general sense that America has that it's sort of lost its way in the world and is looking to figure out what role to play. And I want to come and talk about your vision more positively as we get into our conversation. But I wanted to start where you start in the book, where you're meeting with a group of people from Syria who are engaged in the struggle against Assad, and ask you the question of what should we be doing now about Syria, because it seems, with the town of Kobani apparently about to fall or being fought over, that we've kind of let this situation get so far out of control. It's hard to see where the restoration of order and civil society, civilian society ever comes from in that region. What should we be doing at this point?
Well, I met these people in Los Angeles in 2013. There were about a half a dozen of them. And some of them were born in the United States of Syrian descent. Some of them had immigrated here. One was a professor at the University of Arkansas. And they were looking for support. And so it really forced my attention onto this in 2013. When I wrote the book and submitted it to the publisher the first time in February, people had forgotten about the Syrian opposition. And now it's come full cycle, and they're back in the center of the news. Look, the Middle East is going to be in turmoil for decades. We're in the sort of mid-stage of a 300-year struggle within Islam to understand how God's chosen people, given the gift of God's rules of behavior by Muhammad, can somehow not be superior to these barbarians from the West that came in with technology and money and so forth. And Islam keeps trying to reinvent the answer to it. And one of the fundamental strains of Islam is extremist Sharia philosophy, the Wahhabist strain. It's been going for 200, almost 300 years now. And that's what's behind the immediate problem of ISIS. And so what must you do about this? Well, in the news today, you'll find that President Obama went to the Pentagon, sure, because an air campaign won't work against ISIS by itself. Why would it? I mean, it's no big surprise. You're flying at 25,000 feet in a high-performance aircraft. You've got 4 bombs under your wing, and you're looking at the ground. You can't see anything down there unless it's the size of a house. And you've got some instruments, and it's like looking through a soda straw as you walk across a room. You don't see the big picture, and you can't get low, because if you take a couple of rounds in the wrong place in an F-16, you're toast. And so you drop a bomb and you hit a truck. Somebody says, well, how much did that truck cost, or how much did that bomb cost? Well, the truck was stolen. It didn't cost them anything, and the bomb cost $20,000. No kidding. Well, how long is that going to last? And so it's taken the press a few weeks to pick this up about this air campaign and say, well, this doesn't make sense. It was never intended to make sense. It only works in conjunction with ground forces. The ground forces have to come from Iraq. They have to come from the Kurds in northern Iraq. They have to come from the Syrian opposition, and maybe from neighboring states like Turkey or Saudi Arabia. They have to be coordinated, and they have to draw on the assets of air power with eyes on target, either from low-flying drones continuously overhead or forward observers. But more than that, you can't solve this problem with military force. I listen to the press and I'm appalled. People keep saying, you gotta have ground troops. Yes, it's true. Some ground troops are necessary, but ground troops and air power are not sufficient to solve this problem. You must provide governance, effective governance, over Syria. We don't like Bashar Assad. We're not going to promote his return to power, I hope. And so you've got to create governance. So here comes the Syrian opposition then. So here's what you need. It's a 4-part program. You need U.S. air power. You need the Turks to come in right now while you're building up the Syrian opposition. You need to control and put an air cover, a no-fly zone, over northern Syria. Tell the Syrian opposition, Bud, you get in there on the ground, you prove you can govern in there. They told me a year ago at Los Angeles, a year and a half ago, that they were good. They had all practiced this and worked out how to govern and everything. I said, well, get in there. They've told me for a year and a half they can't get in there because they don't have any air cover. Well, give them the air cover. Turkey wants the air cover. They want the air cover. We're already bombing. Put the no-fly zone in over northern Syria. Stop procrastinating. Then let the Turks come in and temporarily provide cover. Get a signed agreement with Turkey that it will withdraw. Make them recognize the Syrian opposition as the legitimate government for northern Syria, and then direct all of your military assistance and training through the Syrian loyal opposition, and cut off the funds and weapons going to the terrorists. There'll be some battles on the ground, but those battles can be won. This is a coalition approach. It's not as rapid as ISIS can react, but it has staying power, long-term staying power, and it is the appropriate solution for the area.
And how close is any of this to actually happening?
Well, I can't say because I wasn't at that meeting at the Pentagon, but I hope Marty Dempsey told him, you got to have a political solution. You know, I was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and the Ukrainians are desperate for U.S. assistance of weapons and so forth to fend off Putin. There's a ceasefire, but it's not really a ceasefire. And what we keep hearing about Ukraine is there's no military solution. There's never a purely military solution. Every conflict that you can end has to be ended by a diplomatic solution. Look, at the end of World War II, after we completely conquered Nazi Germany, we had Admiral Dönitz, after Hitler committed suicide, we had Admiral Dönitz sign the surrender document. At the end of World War II, MacArthur held a surrender ceremony on the battleship Missouri after we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. They had to sign over the legal authority. The only time we haven't done that is Iraq, where, for whatever reason, we weren't smart enough to do it. There's never going to be a purely military solution that will ever be a solution. You're not going to kill ISIS and eliminate it entirely because it's an idea that's promoted by the oil revenues that go into Saudi Arabia and Qatar.
But to what extent do you feel that the criticism that's made that policy over the past few years has created a vacuum that's made it easier for that idea to take hold? Would you give that credence?
Sure, that's true, but it's not. I mean, we can't look at the world through only the U.S.'s eyes. I mean, there have been various efforts to deal with the modernization problem for Islam. One of those efforts was state socialism. So you had people like Gamal Abdel Nasser, you had the United Arab Republic with Syria, you had Hafiz al-Assad, and you had Saddam Hussein, all of whom believed you could run a secular socialist state to build up Arab power. And it basically didn't work. You had Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who believed you could dispense with Islam, change the alphabet, get away from all that stuff, prevent women from covering their hair, and work with the West. That hasn't worked. I mean, it's been rejected in Turkey. Now, there's a lot of people who are bemoaning that, and there's a lot of strong opposition to President Erdogan. But no, I think if you lay this blame on President Obama, that's the way politics works. And one of the reasons I wrote this book, Matthew, is people are so sick of the divisive politics in this country and the finger pointing and the personalization of politics. It's so incredibly self-destructive for America. We have to come together as a nation. There's important things to get done, and we can't afford to wait for the next war to bring us together.
I mean, do you think Leon Panetta was out of order in writing the book that he wrote?
No, I think Leon Panetta has a perfect right as a retired, very prominent civil servant in appointed politics to say exactly what he thinks. And when he wants to say it, he should say it. I probably wouldn't have done it the way Leon Panetta did, but you know, every person has that. He probably felt he had an obligation to say it, and to say it soon enough that it could make a difference.
Because that seems to be the issue, and there does seem to be a frustration in parts of the government with the leadership and the sense of inaction and passivity when confronted with some of these threats.
Well, yes, there is frustration, but the larger frustration is actually the frustration over the economy. And there's a political dynamic that works in America. And, you know, I did, as you mentioned, I ran, or as Ann mentioned, I ran for office. And so I got to learn the military world and diplomatic world in uniform, and then I got to learn the political world in a whirlwind 5.5 months in this, and then staying with it and campaigning for others over the last decade. And the two parties in America have their own dynamic. They have certain likes and propensities and dislikes, and there's a certain way you communicate. The Democratic Party is a party of fairness. The Republican Party tends to promote the fear emotion. And it's been this way for a long time. So if I speak to a Democratic audience, I talk about people who need help. If I talk to a Republican audience, I talk about the strength of America's armed forces. If you reversed it and you looked at those audiences' faces, they'd think you were crazy. The Democrats would say, that guy's a warmonger. Listen to him talk about aircraft carriers and soldiers. We're not interested in that. And if you went and talked about the difficulty that poor people had, Republicans in these audiences, they'd say, they should work harder. And so there's different conversations going on in America, and they tend to become focused as you move into an election on the personification of that philosophy. And right now it happens to be focused on the President of the United States and on this on the Democratic political party. And there's a concerted effort to show that Democrats can't handle national security. The truth is, President Obama, when he came to office, he was well aware of this tendency. He turned the military and national security policy over to the Republicans. He left Bob Gates in as Secretary of Defense. He put in Leon Panetta as a CIA director, but Leon's a very conservative guy. And he brought in my friend, retired General Jim Jones, as a national security advisor, who McCain's best buddy and a full-fledged Republican. He could have picked somebody else to be national security advisor, but he didn't. He wanted protection from the Republicans as he worked through the national security process. He figured he could I'm just sort of imagining this, but he probably felt like he could represent the Democratic side well enough, but you got to deal with Congress on this, and they had their role to play. He brought that in. So you can't accuse him of being soft. When he picked out Osama bin Laden, took him out, he wasn't soft. He made a tough decision against the recommendations of the majority of his cabinet, and I give him a lot of credit for that. So now he's in a triple bind. Am I talking too much?
No, this is very interesting.
So he's got China, increasingly assertive in the Pacific. You know, the Chinese came here in May of 2013, and President Xi Jinping told Obama to his face, he said, "We're your global equal, and we expect to be treated that way." Can you imagine that? I mean, if you ask the American people, hey, you think China's the global equal of America? The American people would say, no, we're the exceptional power. We have, nobody can do anything in the world without us. Well, here's another country that they don't see it that way. And they're increasingly assertive and increasing their economy at a growth rate of 4 or 5 times greater than the United States. You've got Ukraine and Russia. Now, this is a very serious problem in Ukraine. I've been over there 3 times, and I met with Poroshenko, the president, when he came to Washington 3 weeks ago. He's in a war. Now, you wouldn't know it's a war because you get these nice snippets in newspapers around America of, oh, the Russian separatists, they had a wedding ceremony behind occupied lines, and oh, it's so sad about them. Yeah, it's real sad. But what they don't tell you is most of them are Russian intelligence agents. The Russians have practiced their war plan since 2009 on an anti-terrorism model. And at first we thought, oh, gee, they're working against terrorists. No, they're not. They're creating the terrorists. So the Russian war games go terrorism, insurgency, Russian forces come in, NATO tries to interfere, and Russia uses nuclear weapons against NATO. And so that's the 2009 war game, the 2013 war game. And they created the terrorism in Ukraine by putting the little green men in and the Spetsnaz. They then created, using the Russian military intelligence, the partisans, the so-called separatists. I'm not saying they didn't find a few local Ukrainians who didn't know any better and agreed to shoot things up for $100 a month that they were paying, but all that was organized and controlled and coming out of Russia.
Okay,
and so you've got that, and you've got the Middle East. It's all come together in one really tough scenario at a time when the U.S. economy is kind of sputtering along. This is a tough time for America.
But there are two issues. One is this cumulative effect, this sort of perfect storm in a way. And then there's the individual conflicts or potential conflicts, which probably each of the three has rather different underlying dynamics.
Sure.
But I mean, this coming together, there's this sense that we've written about it in The Economist that America is still the superpower. Yes, we're in a phase of moving to maybe a more multipolar world. Maybe China emerges as the new superpower at some point, but we're not there yet. But nonetheless, America is sort of reluctant to play the role that the world is expecting it to play. It doesn't want to be the superpower. You even get this phrase of superpower suicide talked about, that America's backing away from things where it could be still projecting superpower dominance. And I just wondered if you'd talk a bit about, do you think there's anything to that?
Not as much as meets the eye. So take the case of ISIS, where we began. So there's three agendas at work in ISIS. There's a legitimate problem with ISIS terrorism and threats to the United States, and a need to do something about ISIS. Then there's a political motif that covers this. You see in the partisan discussions that say Democrats and Obama, they're not any good at national security. Republicans are good at this. We're hard, we're tough. And of course, underlying that is the fact that Obama ran against the Iraq War and pulled the troops out. So if they can persuade him to put ground troops in, then the next step is, hey, and why don't you just, while you're at it, admit you should have kept them there? And then once you said, admit you were wrong on national security. And then, hey, it's a smooth slide into the 2016 presidential election, and you get your man in office. So there's a political, and then behind that, there's a Saudi and Qatari role. As one of my retired general officer friends, who's former high-ranking official in another department, put it to me, he says, a certain country in the Middle East is looking for the cheapest mercenaries to fight for them against ISIS, and they're looking at us. Sure, because where did ISIS come from? It came from extremist Sharia philosophy. We've spent billions, trillions of dollars buying Saudi oil over 40 years of American energy independence, and they've recycled billions of petrodollars to support extremist Sharia philosophy. That's the very philosophy ISIS is using. The press says there may be 15,000 Saudis in ISIS, and guess where they're headed? To Mecca and Medina, because which extremist Sharia nation is not actually living up to its commitments under Sharia law? Saudi Arabia. When they leave Saudi Arabia, they're not bound by the law, the royal family. So there's three different agendas at play. That's why I say it's not quite what you think. There's lots of pushing and shoving, and if you were in the White House, you would feel like you were still at the cockpit of the world. You'd be getting calls say, you have to do this. Does a president have to do everything someone tells him he has to do? He's trying to pick and choose and work it. So the idea that we're not, now, you can critique the substance of it, but it's a right thing to try to redeploy it from this excessive focus on the Mideast. As I explained in the book, the war in Iraq was a mistake. The real logic for America is stay close to Europe, because you cannot manage the ascent of China into world affairs if you've lost your strong connection to Europe. There's no historical precedent for China's emergence on the world scene.
Before we come to China, let's just quickly deal with Russia and Ukraine, because I guess there's a lot of people feel that was more sort of cock up by the European Union failing to get its diplomacy in order, rather than a serious resurgence of Russian ambition and so forth.
But that would be a mistake. That would be a
Do
mistake.
you think there is something more serious?
From 1999, when Putin was the KGB, now called the FSB chief, until then he was prime minister, then he became president, he's always tried to recreate the Soviet Union. He's wanted the Soviet Union back. He's lusted for that space. He sees the world as a chessboard. He sees it in terms of geostrategy. He would see China as the long-term challenge for Russia. He would tell you that Russia can't stand against China unless it's back to the space of the Soviet Union. He would tell you that Ukraine is the heart of reestablishing the Soviet Union. And he had a program to reel in Ukraine. He had friendly politicians. He paid off the oligarchs and gave them special concessions so they would, work for the Russian economy. He kept the defense industry in the Donetsk basin and in central Ukraine. He had worked to infiltrate the army and police with military intelligence agents. It was his country. And suddenly, these people came into the square in Maidan, and they snatched it right away from him. He'd like to blame it on Victoria Nuland in the United States, but you can't. You better blame it on the example set by his system of governance versus what was happening in a country like Poland. In 1992, Ukraine was wealthier per capita than Poland. By 2013, Poland is 3 times wealthier per capita than Ukraine. And the Ukrainians could travel, they could watch, they could feel it, and they want their own country. So it wasn't a cock-up caused by a mistake by the European Union. It's a run-up against a long-term Putin ambition from a man who sees the world in anachronistic terms.
But I suppose, even if we say that it's not a cock-up, it's not that there is this ambition there. Is it still a sort of last spasm of a declining power, or is there a more serious long-term issue that we've got to deal with?
That depends on us as much as it does on him. It should be the last spasm of a declining power. But Putin is a very smart guy who's very calculating. He's broad-gauged. He uses power. He's cautious and calculating, but willing to take calculated risks. So it's like one of the guys who saw him in Texas told me. He said, "I'll tell you one thing about Putin." I said, "What's that?" He said, "He's short." Well, that's not the most important thing about Putin. Stalin was like 5'3" or 5'4". You can't judge a man's character or strength by his physical stature. It's a big mistake. Putin he's a very worthy leader, but he sees things the way he's been educated through his own perspective, and he sees a different view of the world. I'll give you an example. In 1999, I was dealing with a general in Romania who was the head of their military, and he said to me, General Clark, he said, the KGB is trying to keep Romania from becoming a member of NATO. I said, well, sure. What else is new? He said, yes, but the way they're going to do it, you see, here's the way they view the world. And he drew out this map of Europe, and it showed the outlines of the countries, and it showed these like jumps, like on a chessboard, boom, boom, boom. I'd just been to Moscow and had this same discussion with the chief of the Russian General Staff, I'll think of his name in a second. And he said, "You're taking our countries." I said, "They're not your countries." He says, "They're our countries. We're selling arms to them, and you're trying to take them so you can sell arms to them." I said, we don't care what arms they buy. Let them buy the best arms. He said, "And you're going to take our mineral resources and make us poor." So you say, well, that's a really unsophisticated way of looking at the world. It may be, but it's the way it's looked at from Moscow. And so I warned this Romanian general. I said, please don't take that map with these arrows. Don't show anybody that map in Europe, because they don't see the world that way. They think the world is about free trade and agreements and interests, and can't we work together and make a better world for everybody, and I'll give you this. And they think it's like Ricardo and the principle of comparative advantage in international trade. Said they don't understand this. He said, yes, General Clark. 3 weeks later, he's in Brussels. He's showing this map all over. And I get a call from the president of Romania and said, we've had to fire our chief of defense. Yeah, because people thought he was in Russia in Brussels trying to be anti-Russian. He was only explaining he'd been to the Russian military academy. He knew exactly how they thought. So if we handle Putin the right way.
Which is what?
We've got to help Ukraine stay in the struggle for its own independent identity. It doesn't have to be a member of NATO, but it does need enough armaments and military support, economic support, and energy support so that it doesn't collapse over the winter. And so that means we've got to be brave enough to say to Vladimir Putin, look, bud, we have a different vision of this thing, and these people are fighting for what they consider their freedom. We know what you're doing, and we don't accept it. So if people who share our values come to us and ask for assistance, you know what we're going to do? We're going to help them. So get over it. And Vladimir would get over it. He wouldn't like it, but he would get over it.
So you think it wouldn't come to armed conflict?
But if we let the momentum build, we'll end up with a personality in the Kremlin that has gone through the exact steps that Hitler went through in the 1930s. You know, under the Versailles Treaty, the German military was limited to 100,000 men. It was prevented from entering the Rhineland area, which was the western part of Germany, next to France, by treaty. Hitler became chancellor in 1933, started building up the German armed forces, started a rearmament program, got the economy going, dealt with the industrialists. It was fascism. It was state capitalism. And he used American investment in industries like Thyssen and Krupp to build this military machine. He was nervous. The Allies could have stepped in, but we didn't. And then he put military forces in the Rhineland. He was nervous. The Allies could have stepped in, but they didn't. And then he took Austria. He was nervous. The Allies could have stepped in, but they didn't. And so with each move, he persuaded the doubters in the German military who said, this guy, he was a corporal in World War I, he doesn't know anything about the military, he doesn't know anything about world affairs, he's a bombastic, short little guy with a mustache. He persuaded them step by step that they were wrong, that he knew more than they did. So we don't want to go through the same learning process with Mr. Putin. We don't know what he really thinks, we don't know what his intentions are, but we know how he's been schooled, we know what the tendencies are, and we know what our own proclivities are. We tend to not want to face reality on something like this.
But does that mean we have to send a lot of troops in?
No, it means, but they would like to have some anti-tank missiles. They'd like to have the radars to tell where the artillery is coming from. They'd like to have some unmanned aerial vehicles. Do you know that on the 28th of August, the Ukrainian military lost several hundred armored vehicles in combat to the most modern Russian weapon systems? According to the Russian press, more than 10 combat maneuver groups of Russia's finest forces were inserted in the week preceding and basically attacked the Ukrainian forces in the back. They were guided by unmanned aerial vehicles. They were supported by Russian artillery that was firing from over the border in Russia and inside Ukraine. And the Ukrainians never had a chance. They lost maybe 50% of their combat power in a period of a couple of days. And with that, they lost the hope of securing their own territory. Poroshenko had to ask for a ceasefire. So the story's hard to get out because the Russian disinformation machine is incredibly powerful and seductive. And so people ask these questions, Russia says, of course we don't have troops in there. Well, I mean, they say that's the that's the Ukrainians. You know, they're fascists. They don't know anything. We're Russia. We don't have any troops in there. And so, you know, gradually, you know, we got the intercepted communications. Yeah, they sure sound like Russians. We know who they're talking to. They're talking to Moscow. And we know what uniform they're wearing. It's Russian. We know where the equipment came from. It's Russian also. We say they captured it. Ukraine didn't have any of that kind of equipment. But it doesn't penetrate the he said, she said analysis in most of the media. So it's hard to get the truth out. Russians know this. They exploit it. So it makes it harder for us to respond. Now, if we handle things right, Russia's not a problem. They're not one of the 5 long-term problems. Russia will come to terms with the West, and Putin will pass into history, and new Russian leader will emerge and says, you know, we can do a lot better if we work with the West. They're not going to come in here and hurt us. They come in here to make money. We should make money off them, and that's the end of it. But we got to get through that, and to do that, got to help Ukraine. If Ukraine were to fall, then, and already, Eastern Europe is quaking like jello. I talked to one prime minister of an East European country who's a member of NATO. I said, look, you need to help Ukraine. This was about 2 weeks ago. He said, we can't. I said, well, why can't you? He said, well, the United States is not, you know, giving them aid. We can't do it. I said, why not? He said, well, because we're afraid. So the word's out in Eastern Europe. That's very destructive because our relationship with NATO is the key to keeping Europe and the United States together and keeping us together on a security basis, which is the foundation for all the economy, rule of law, international courts, is critical to helping manage the ascent of China and its integration as a responsible member of the world community.
Now, to what extent, moving to China, should we think of China as an enemy or a competitor or a rival?
Well, think of it as a potential. It could be a friend, it could be a partner, it could become an adversary. Right now, it's 4 times the size of the United States, 10 times the scale of Japan, integrated in the world economy the way the Soviet Union never was, and has a power and weight far greater than that of Germany in the early 20th century. So there's no historical precedent for this. China has the outward appearance of a capitalist society with markets and stock ownership and private enterprises called state-owned enterprises, and lots of entrepreneurs and lots of good Chinese people over here, and we like them.
Americans, yeah, if we were quoting David Ricardo, as you were earlier, I mean, there's a win-win.
Yeah, it can be, you know. I mean, they take our debt, we take their manufactured goods, we export technology and jobs, they give us consumer products. Some people would say that's not a win-win, but that's the way it's worked out for the last 15 or 20 years. The thing about it is that appearances are deceiving. China is a centrally directed economy. There's a 5-year plan that the Chinese Communist Party carefully puts together. They bring in McKinsey to help them get the plan right. And you think, oh, McKinsey, well, that makes it a good plan. No, it makes it a plan. Whereas if you look at the United States...
With McKinsey's record, that's probably the best weapon America's got, isn't it?
Actually, now I'm surprised you would say that. Because there's a lot of very good people in McKinsey that you know quite well, including my good friend, the economist Michael Spence, who won a Nobel Prize in economics and did one of the foremost studies in the world on why nations grow, and he consults with China. They listen, but then they fold it into what they see as necessary for China. So, you know, we criticize them and say, look, they got all this real estate, it's not occupied. True, but they're going to move 250 million people into those villages. And they're not taking their agriculture and they're not buying U.S. combines and tractors. True. They're going to keep 600 million people in very intensive subsistence agriculture. They're going to give them better support and so forth, but they don't have jobs for those people in the industrialized society, and they figured this out. They have a space program that's pretty advanced. And so when you look at China, you see the unfolding of a multi-decades plan. It's sharpened up every 5 years. It's continuously examined, evaluated, and worked. But there's a central guiding hand behind what looks like the inchoate progress of the economy.
But are they the next war that we shouldn't be waiting for if you take the...
Well, I hope
I
they're
think
not a
it
war. I hope that we can persuade China that its interests are best served by being a responsible member of the world community. But you know, there's no guarantee. It's not clear. China will make its own assessment of us. Now, when I went to China before 2008, one of my Chinese friends who was a close advisor to President Hu's youth ministries, he said, China knows that Britain and America were best friends, and Britain gave you, America, the leadership of the world. China wants to be best friends with America, so you will give us leadership of the world. Well, sounds incredibly naive, but also kind of friendly and nice, you know. But after 2008, you don't hear that in China. What you hear is, what's wrong with America? You politicians fight and hate each other. You have unemployment. Your economy doesn't grow. Look at China. I'm on Chinese television. They're asking me these canned state questions like, why does America not learn lessons from China's progress? Good question. Well, there are a lot of answers to that. But it's the question that shows the perception of the United States. And what was once a relationship that was a tutor-pupil relationship in some ways, a donor relationship, is now much different. It's a rising power looking at a country that they see as increasingly failing in its own internal system, but willing to strike out with military force in its own self-interest. So they don't see the legitimacy of that. We have to guide American policy, we have to have an appreciation for how we appear to others.
But I mean, that idea of American weakness, the failings of the government system, I mean, that's not only the Chinese that are saying that. I mean, a lot of Americans are saying that. Yeah. Probably a lot of people in this room feel like the government is maybe the weak point.
Well, they do, yeah.
Do you share that view?
Well, you know, it's a funny thing. Now, I think you have a British accent, if I'm not wrong.
Well spotted, yeah.
Right? Right. And you're working for a British publication called The Economist.
Exactly.
And David Niven always said that a good British accent is worth at least $50,000 extra in America. And because we listen carefully to people with good British accents. But you know, the last CEO-led government we had in America was the government of George III of England. And we fought the Revolutionary War to get rid of it. In this country, we don't like a strong executive leadership in Washington unless there's a crisis or a war. The problem that we're in right now is in the world situation we've got to have a plan, and we've got to have some central direction to deal with the convergence of events and forces and challenges coming at America, and we can't afford to wait for the next war. So this is a very tough sell in the United States. I always explain to my friends in China, look, you all have disputes in China too, but they're done in private. Ours are done public. It's what the great virtue of America is. You let interest counteract interest and ambition counteract ambition. Federalist 51, Madison. And it's out in the open and everybody can see it. That's what we probably would have liked a better, stronger government, at least Hamilton and Madison would have when they wrote about the Constitution, but it was the strongest government you could get. It was better than the Articles of Confederation, which had preceded it. But even today, if you look at America and you go abroad and you explain to people, there's an election coming up, they say, well, what were you doing? I said, well, I was in Ohio and we were working against voter suppression. They say, voter suppression? What's that? I said, well, you know, there's these efforts to prevent people from voting. They said, how can that be in America? I said, well, you know, they close the polls early and they only will begin early voting at a certain time, and it gets involved in the court system, and because one party gets an advantage from it versus another party, et cetera, et cetera. And people are astonished that this is the way the American system works. It's a rough and ready system. If you look at the floating chads from the 2000 Florida election, you think, my God, we couldn't do any better than that. But you know, if you go right now in 2014, you'll find that We haven't really fixed the election system all across America. And there are efforts in states to control the time, the opening time of the polls, the locations of the polls, because one party versus another perceives an advantage or disadvantage in the mechanics of the election process. So that's the rough and ready American version of democracy. It's not a perfect system. And I have to explain to the Chinese that the last Asian country that looked at America and said, capitalism, America, it's a failing system, was Japan in 1932. And they got it wrong with disastrous consequences. So my friends in China have to be careful not to misunderstand what America's like. We're not a failing system, but we've got enormous potential we're not using. And what I'm trying to say in the book, Matthew, is I want us to use this potential in peacetime before we have to come together in a war. Take energy independence. Why, we've been spending hundreds of billions of dollars every year importing petroleum products to fuel our automobiles, when, if we are careful and smart, we can produce all of the liquid fuel we need right here in America and still have extra to export. We don't have to be held hostage to the price on the world energy market or to the politics of the Middle East if we'll get our own domestic house in order. Why can't we do that? If there was a war, we would. Well,
so do you think, I mean, the president's reluctance to approve a certain pipeline and some of the states' refusal, like New York, to go along with fracking, I mean, that's part of what you're criticizing?
Yeah, well, that's symptomatic of the issues, you know. I mean, the question is, okay, you got an issue. Let's get to the bottom of it. What's the answer to it? Deal with it in technical and engineering terms. Put it through an accelerated legal process of challenge and review. Take it to the Supreme Court if that's what has to be done, but don't sit on it. We've got to move this country forward. $300 billion a year. If you kept that money in the United States of America, and by the way, the pipeline wouldn't keep that money in the United States. It's bringing Canadian oil in. So it's associated, but it's not really. The fracking in New York, yes. But if you kept $300 billion a year in the U.S. economy, you'd get another 75, maybe more, in taxation from that for the federal government. You'd have the money to fix your infrastructure, send kids to school, and stop the divisive arguments over cutting Social Security and Medicare versus raising taxes. You'd kick this economy into an accelerated growth mode, going from 2.5%, 3% per year on an annual basis to 4.5%, 5%, 5.5% per year. And you could do it without inflation. All of those skills are there. There's $7 trillion sitting unused in the banks, and nobody knows that better than the economists because you write about it all the time. There's 15 million Americans who are unemployed, underemployed, or out of the workforce but could be brought back into the workforce. There's a whole system of community colleges and VOTEC skills that can teach those people to be extremely relevant in high-tech industry or in the energy business if they want jobs, and if you pay enough, they'll take those jobs. And all the technology is there that we need. We just opened the first big cellulosic ethanol plant in Iowa earlier this month, 25 million gallons a year, cellulosic ethanol. Imagine, they said it couldn't be done. It can be done, and it'll be cheaper per gallon than gasoline. And no matter what the American Petroleum Institute tells you, cars can do pretty well on 15 or 20% ethanol.
So if we talk about,
you can do this.
So if we talk about energy, I guess there are two issues that come up time and time again. I mean, one is the suspicion of the new alternative technologies around getting gas and oil out of the ground. Right. The other is obviously the question of climate change, and is it real, and can there be any agreement around a price for carbon and so forth? I mean, what's your strategy for dealing with both of those issues?
Well, you've got to bring these two opposing forces together. So you've got to bring the science. One of the things about America that we all know, but we don't like to talk about, is we can do a lot of studies in this country, and generally, often the studies will show whatever the donor that pays for the studies wants it to show. It's very seldom that a think tank does a study that's paid for by, let's say, the American Petroleum Institute that says that oil is a very bad thing for the economy. And so we have to be careful on the scientific side and the study side. It's really a political issue. And, you know, environmental groups, they need the Keystone Pipeline because they were dying without the Keystone Pipeline. It's energized millions of dollars of fundraising from environmental groups, and they need that kind of an issue. Somehow we have to rise above that as a country and bring the American Petroleum Institute, Growth Energy, which is the biofuels and ethanol advocacy group, and the environmental movement all together to do what's in the interest of the larger good of the country and deal with each of the issues that they bring up. We can produce more oil and we can be more environmentally careful and protective of the environment in doing so. We can put in a carbon tax of $25 a ton, which we should do, and raise the price of gasoline about 20 cents a gallon. And you know what? It won't hurt the economy at all. It won't inhibit the oil industry one bit, but it will make America the global leader in dealing with climate change. And we need to do that. Now, these are things that each side can advocate and be proud of if they'll come together for the larger good. And it shouldn't take a war to bring this country together.
So as you look at the coming midterm elections and then towards another presidential campaign, you know, do you feel, what are the 2 or 3 questions that should be top of the agenda for anyone running in that campaign? I'm assuming you're not running because you've done it before and you didn't sound like you felt you were cut out for it when we were talking before.
Well, I don't think for me it's the best contribution I could make. I love this country. I hope people will come together. I got into partisan politics and discovered it's partisan. And so it's what my wife said. Honey, she said, when you were just a general, they all liked you. As soon as you became a Democrat, 30% of the people don't like you now because you're not a Republican. And so that's the downside of elective politics. My friends in Arkansas said, Wes, you may not like it, but it's the way the country's governed. That's the positive side. So you have to figure out how you can best make a contribution. And I think we need to work to bring the country together. Now, you asked me what are the big issues in the election going to be. National security is going to be a big issue. The economy is going to be a big issue. And underneath that, one of the biggest issues is campaign finance reform. And I don't know if we're ever going to get at that issue. Because when I go around
it sounds like it's going the other way at the moment.
It's going the other way, and when I go around the world and I listen to our diplomats and inveigh against corruption in foreign governments, and they tell me how corrupt it is, and how they lecture these governments. You can't do this. You must have a competitive bid for these contracts. You can't be doing it on the basis of personal relationships. It sounds really good. But then I come back in this country, I say, wait. Is it true that 90% of the contracts of our big defense contractor are sole source bids? Well, yeah. Well, how does that work out? Oh, I went to the defense contractor and asked. They said, it's easy. We won't take anything less than $1 billion, and we structure it, we sell it on the Hill, and we make sure the specs can only be met by us. Oh, well, that's not corruption. That's just good business practice. Or you look at the lobbying industry. The relationships in Washington, is it okay to be, I don't want to get this too personal, but is it okay to be like married to a lobbyist if you're a big figure in government? And then she makes millions of dollars because she's your wife? That's not corrupt because she's allowed to have her own career, okay? But if people gave millions of dollars to the wife of a dictator in some East European country, they'd say that was corrupt. So there are different standards, and you realize that yes, it's important to have good governance, and there shouldn't be corruption, but be careful. We're not perfect in this democracy either. So this campaign finance reform is the underlying issue because money is the decisive factor right now in American politics.
But do you see any way to turn this argument round? Because it does seem, particularly with the current Supreme Court, that there isn't a lot of enthusiasm for it.
I think you're going to have to turn it around through legislation. The legislation is going to have to win passage and be veto-proof in the United States Congress. And
but that is
I don't think
Turkey
it's
is voting for
impossible.
Thanksgiving, isn't it? Really, I mean, why would they vote for
It's
campaign finance reform?
well, because each and every one of them is in themselves a victim of the current campaign financing system. If you go to a U.S. Senate office and you talk candidly to a senator, they'll tell you what their funding target is. It tends to be, in some of the states, $20,000 a day. For 6 years, they must raise $20,000 a day, or $50,000 a week, or $6,000 a week. They must make a continuous series of phone calls. Don't you think that interferes with doing the business for the public that they're elected to do? Of course it does, and it cuts across all the parties. It's an amazing thing. Most of these people in Congress, in the Senate at least, are worth millions of dollars. And you would think they finance their own elections. Oh, they don't. And the outside interest groups put millions of dollars in. You know, really, if you could just go to the media and say, look, you need to give free airtime. Here's the way it's done. You're going to take 6 months or 6 weeks before the election and give so many hours of free airtime. Of course, GE won't like that because they own, I think it's NBC.
They used to.
And whoever big business is needs that revenue from television. But it's the private good versus the public good. And we have to have leaders in this country who can help people understand the public good and convince them to pursue it without waiting for a war to bring people together.
So we've got a few questions here from members of the audience. One is that you argue that the US needs a grand strategy. And maybe you'll talk a bit about that. But the question is, can you cite an example of a country that has one?
Well, I think China has a grand strategy, and I think Russia has a grand strategy. I'm not sure about Britain, but I mean, their grand strategy is basically, keep a foot in Europe and stay close to the United States and be the bridge. Our grand strategy has been pretty simple all these years, and since the end of World War II, we've recognized we fought 2 world wars in the 20th century to connect us to Europe. We could not tolerate the domination of Central and Western Europe by a hostile power. Took us a long time in World War I to come to that realization. We didn't want to come to that realization in World War II, but Japan helped us in that sense, because when they bombed, Hitler declared war, and we were in it. And we decided Europe first. That was a kind of fundamental reaffirmation and it's no different today. The European Union's over 500 million people now. It's got a GDP that's the same size and maybe a little larger than that of the United States, despite the fact that it's not growing very fast. And it's the part of the world that most closely shares America's values and interests. So it's not a big leap in understanding grand strategies to say, stay close to Europe, keep them tied to the United States, and then support those around the world who share your values. And be a little bit humble, because they have to lead their own countries, use force only as a last resort, and use it multilaterally if possible, and in accordance with international law, and only as a last resort unilaterally if you must. I mean, that's the basic American grand strategy.
But the grand strategy you argue for is?
The grand strategy I argue for is a little bit different. I'm arguing for a national strategy. That is to say, I'm arguing for the 21st century analog of what Eisenhower created in 1953. When he became the president, he, in his inaugural address, said, "We're facing evil. We see the force of evil against us," talking about Marxism, Leninism, Stalin, and communism that had overrun Eastern Europe. He said, it's a lifetime struggle between the forces of good and evil. It's more important than that which divides us as Democrats and Republicans in America. And we must submerge our differences and work together to combat this threat, this existential threat to America. And in Eisenhower's 8 years in office, that's the theme he played out. And of course, there were a lot of shocks and bumps along the road. The Soviet Union exploded its first thermonuclear weapon, and there was the ICBM launch, and there was Sputnik and the missile gap, and there was Hungary in 1956, and Khrushchev threatened to unleash a sea of fire on the world if we didn't call off the Israeli, British, and French invasion of Egypt, and so forth. But Eisenhower weathered all through that, and he held to this strategy, and it set a pattern that every succeeding president throughout the Cold War years could use. There was an existential threat outside America. We could differ at home, but we had to pull together on national security issues. By and large, it worked. I mean, Democrats always liked arms control. Republicans always said, let's buy some more weapons. And so there was a difference, but still, on the fundamental issues, the parties were together. What we need is a new strategy like that. Eisenhower didn't go to war. In fact, he avoided it in Southeast Asia and in 1956 in the Hungarian intervention. He knew what war would bring, but he used the threat to pull America together. Today, we're facing long-term challenges that are very threatening to America. Those challenges are terrorism and cybersecurity and financial system stability, the ascent of China, climate change. Can't we pull together as a nation to deal with those threats, get our economy restarted? Eisenhower knew that if you bankrupted America to build more military, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, God love them, they always want more forces. It's the way we are in the military. You know, if you say, what's your plan to defend Germany? You say, need 100 divisions. Why do you need 100 divisions? Well, because the Soviets would have 200 divisions, and if they get 3-to-1 superiority, said, okay, you can't have 100 divisions. Said, okay, Mr. President, you understand we're living with high risk. He said, I accept the risk. So that's what it was. And we lived with that risk, and Eisenhower took it. It was so bad that the Army Chief of Staff resigned, wrote a book against Ike, his own boss. They called it, the title of the book was The Uncertain Trumpet by Maxwell Taylor. Argued that Ike had it all wrong on defense strategy. He wanted more money for the Army. Ike wanted that money for the American economy. Now, the same principle holds today. We don't want to disarm America, but there's no point in having 25 aircraft carrier battle groups and 1.5 million men in uniform on active duty in the Army if the economy's not growing. So we've got to get the economy going in this country. It's not growing, and it's not distributing income and raising the living standards of the American people the way it should. So I'm advocating not grand strategy, but national strategy.
And what, in a nutshell, are the things that we're not doing with the economy that we should be doing?
Well, number one is we're not, Warren Buffett says that you invest in companies where the wind's in the sails, not necessarily the smartest, most articulate CEO, but a company that's in a sector that's growing. The sector that's growing and going great guns in America is energy, petroleum. Invest in it. We can do fracking, we can do gas to liquids, we can do coal to liquids, we can export natural gas, we can export crude. We're exporting 3 million plus barrels a day of refined products now. We've put all the refineries in England out of business, as you probably know. And so, we can do all this. The economy's rip-roaring, ready to go. Let it happen. In fact, encourage it. So that's one thing we could do. We could relook some of the regulatory structures and give better incentives. We need a sovereign wealth fund in the United States. Now, if you go to the state of Texas and they say you have to be friends with Rick Perry to do this. I don't know if that's true or not, but if you bring an investment project to Texas, he has a fund that he can give you money to help get started. In Arkansas, we're building a steel plant, a $1.3 billion steel plant, and a guy named John Correnti's building, a friend of mine. He's a good guy, proven executive, proven leader in the steel industry. We like him, and the governor says he's going to have a bond issue to support that steel plant. Well, that's a plan. States can have plans. Why can't America have a plan to push certain sectors? It seems like we're afraid to, or it seems like, everybody says, no, that's interfering in the free market system.
But weren't you criticizing China for the same thing?
I'm not criticizing China for that at all.
I thought you mentioned 5-year plans with a suspicious look on your face.
I didn't have a suspicious look, sir. Now, perhaps you interpreted my Yankee naivete as suspicion, but I wouldn't want to be under a 5-year plan driven by the Chinese Communist Party. But I can't deny the effectiveness of the process. They achieved more than 3 decades of double-digit economic growth. And I know many of you have traveled to China, and when you see the developments in China, it's amazing. And when they come to America and they go through some of the airports in America, they say, oh my God, we thought America was a developed country like China. And they realize that we're falling behind, and because we can't quite put it together. No, I'm not against what China's doing. It works for them. But we have to find something that works for us. So we need to be able to push certain sectors that are helpful for us in the economy. I think beyond that, we have to look carefully at the financial sector. We haven't learned the lessons from the financial crisis fully. They're not incorporated. The credit rating agencies, I don't think you can defend them from the economist standpoint and say, oh, these are absolutely, they're gold-plated standards. If Moody's says it's investment grade, I promise you it's investment grade. Really? Well, how did Moody's get paid to say that? Well, they might have. Well, would that have influenced their rating? Certainly not. But we found out when we unpacked the financial crisis that, in fact, it had influenced their ratings, despite the fact that they're all men of integrity and women of integrity in these institutions. Somehow the institutions didn't perform their watchdog and rating function. They should have. It's like the way we trade derivatives. Derivatives, credit default swaps, they're like insurance policies. Now, we learned in the 19th century that you can't have a bunch of guys in covered wagons running from homestead to homestead saying, give me $5 and I promise you if the Indians attack you, I'll pay you $1 million, and then taking the $5 and leaving. That's fraudulent insurance. And every state has insurance regulators who prevent it. But nobody prevented the big banks from issuing credit default swaps that says, I'm going to give you, if that bond fails from that country, I'll pay you the value of that bond, but for that insurance, you owe me 0.3 of a point on the value of the bond. It's never going to fail. But then when it started to come unraveled, it turned out that the value of these instruments were in the trillions of dollars. They couldn't be covered. We haven't fixed that yet. And so many of the issues that turned up in the financial crisis have not actually been dealt with. So those are 3 areas of the economy that certainly need attention.
So we've got a couple of political questions. One is, how do you think history will judge President Obama?
It's too early to say with finality because his term's not over. And when his term's over, it's going to be too early to say because you won't see all the consequences for a while. But he'll certainly be looked at as an incredibly gifted, talented man who had some remarkable strengths of character. He rose from a very unlikely background to become President of the United States. He is proof that talent can rise regardless of your beginnings and regardless of the prejudices in American society that are still present. So I think he'll be hailed as a groundbreaking politician who rose to the office of presidency. He's made some real accomplishments in his term. He has presided over the growth of the economy. He presided over the pullout from Iraq, took down Osama bin Laden, and a lot of other achievements on the civilian side, but the record's not done yet. And remember, this is American politics. You know, Matthew, you mentioned my run. Before I ran in 2003, I called my former boss, General Shalikashvili, and I said, sir, I'm thinking about running for the presidency, and he said, Wes, I hear that. I said, well, sir, I just want to know that if I run, you'll support me. He said, Wes, I will support you, but I would ask you, why would anyone want such an office? When you run, they attempt to destroy you. When you're in office, They fight against your every initiative, and when you're finished, you will spend the rest of your life defending what you did in office. It's a tough thing. And so I said, well, sir, I still want your support. He said, okay, fine. But, you know, when you look at the travails that President Obama and his family have gone through, you look at President Clinton, you look at President George W. Bush, I mean, it's a really tough position. And people will tell you, look, the record's not closed on the Bush administration either. It isn't. So, you know, let's keep an open mind. Remember, there's a partisan motive to trying to prejudge Obama right now. And I just don't want to play into that. I want to move away from the personalization of politics and into the trying to pull the country together on a set of issues that are important. And if we get the vision right, then we'll empower whoever's elected to be the next president to execute that vision.
Okay, and then there's a question about, would you support a Hillary run in 2016? And is there any Republican that you would like to see run in 2016?
Well, I would support a Hillary run. I was one of the first people to endorse Hillary in the Ready for Hillary campaign, and so yeah, I think she's an extraordinary woman. I think there's probably nobody who's ever had that much experience before coming into the office that she would occupy if she were to be elected. I mean, think of it. She's seen private enterprise, she's seen state government from the executive level, she's seen national government from the executive level in the White House, she's seen it as a senator, twice elected, and she's seen it as Secretary of State, so she knows the foreign policy side of it, and she brings the dimension to governance of her extraordinary intelligence, her discipline, her tenacity. I think she'd be an extraordinary president. And yes, I'm supporting Hillary Clinton. I've known her for 30 years. I've watched her development as a leader and as a human being, and I think she would make a tremendous president of the United States. I hope she decides to run.
Do you think she will?
I'm hoping she will. You know, she's a grandmother now. And I used to watch these grandparents, and you'd come up to them and say, have you seen this picture of my grandchild? Look at this, isn't he cute? You see some little baby there. I mean, whoever saw a baby that wasn't cute? And, you know, and they're all geniuses. They would say, my grandchild, he just got accepted in the advanced class for calculus, and he's only 2.5. Said, yeah, no, I know he's really smart. He obviously takes after you. And
so you weren't a kissing a baby type of president?
So I am, I guess. Certainly I'm a kissing a baby type. And by the way, you want to see pictures of my grandkids? So, you know, Hillary's going to have to go through this. And I know she and President Clinton are absolutely thrilled by their granddaughter. And so you've got to go through that. So she's going to have to make a tough decision. Now, there are a lot of strong candidates in the Republican Party. I want to name 2 of them because I know that New York City traditionally votes Democratic, and so maybe you don't have an adequate appreciation for these people. But I want to tell you that Mike Huckabee's out there. He was our governor in Arkansas. He's a very smart guy, and he may have been a preacher. And maybe to some people he may sound like he's, you know, just country and you can't believe it, but if you listen to him, he's got a real touch and he can really put his finger on the issue. I heard him on talk radio on Monday morning as I was leaving Little Rock, and he was saying this, and he's got a mellifluous speaking voice. He can tell a joke and he can really pitch it to you. And he said, if you believe that the Ebola campaign or that the campaign against Ebola is under control, and you believe everything that's coming out of Washington and the Center for Disease Control, he said, then you would believe that under Obamacare, you'd be able to keep your own health plan. Now, only 1 or 2 of you laughed. I think a lot of the audience said, oh, Jesus. Yeah, when I heard it, I thought, God, that is a real zinger. So this is a guy who knows how to cut and parry in politics. And don't forget, he won Iowa the last time. Jeb Bush is probably going to run. I mean, I keep hearing reports he's out there, and Jeb Bush is a really solid guy. and he's got the Bush family behind him. A lot of people say, oh God, no, please, not Clinton, Bush again. Yes, but just for a minute, just forget about the families and look at the qualities that a Jeb Bush would bring. He's a governor. He was extremely popular and successful in Florida. He's mature. He's been in the private sector a little bit. He's got his family's relationships and network and experience to draw on. And he's, as far as we can tell, relatively moderate. His wife is Hispanic. His kids, you could say they're Hispanic. He speaks Spanish. So you've got somebody there who would be a formidable leader of the Republican Party. Can he win a primary? That's always the question. But there are two people that are talented in the Republican Party. So I think for Democrats to say, oh, this is over, it's not over. Whoever is going to win this election in 2016 going to earn it.
So our time is pretty much up, but I just want to end by giving you the chance to pitch, because you're going to sign a few copies of your book afterwards. If there's one reason above all else that you think people should read your book, what is that?
This book is a frame for how you can interpret the 24-hour news cycle. And it's the product of everything I've learned and done and seen in the time that I've been on this earth. From the time I started West Point at 17 and started learning leadership lessons to my last trip to Ukraine before I turned the book in on the 31st of March. And so it's all in there in the book, and it's the framing I use when I wake up in the morning and I hear MH370s down in the Pacific, or is it at the Indian Ocean, or is it off Thailand? No, was it stolen? Was he a terrorist? And I saw it day after day and after day, and I say, okay, but what's really happening out here? Or when you see that Kim Kardashian has a new skirt, and it's even shorter than the last skirt, and she's pregnant. Say, okay, well, what's the significance of this?
Is that in here?
Believe me,
wow,
it's in there.
This is quite a book. I missed that bit.
It's in there. In fact, if you put it under a microscope and you look carefully and you can read in there's some embedded in the email version, some pictures. You'd have to find them. And I'm not going to tell you what they are. No, seriously, this is a framing book. So I hope that people will read it and think, we need a long-term vision in this country. You got to look beyond the 24-hour news cycle. Yeah, I really like them on TV. I really like to hear, what happened to the Redskins, or, Eli Manning's injured again, or, Peyton Manning's just such an old guy. He's already 38 years old. How can a guy that old play professional football? But there are a lot of things that are happening around the world that are important, and you don't always see them in the news. But what this book is trying to do is give you a way that if you frame it and you get a data point every couple of weeks or every couple of months in that, you see, cybersecurity, oh yeah. General Clark said something about that. Look, not only did they steal the F-35 secrets, that was 2007, 2008, not only did, when President Xi Jinping saw Obama in May, Obama said, you guys got to stop stealing those secrets. He said, us stealing your secrets? You got that guy breaking into everything. He's spreading the word all over. You guys are doing it to us. And anyway, if you think we're breaking the law, take us to court. So, about 6 months ago, we released the indictments on these 5 Chinese officers who have stolen secrets. We actually have proof in a court. So now J.P. Morgan's been broken in. And you know what? When the Iranians attacked our banks in the summer of 2013, we didn't do anything in retaliation. Some people said it was because they didn't do any real harm. Some people said it was because it was private property and therefore not a concern of the government. Some people said it was because if we'd done anything in retaliation, they could have come back twice as hard and we couldn't have stopped it. I don't know where the truth on that is, but if you look at the challenges I lay out in the book, it'll provide the frame. And so the next time the next company gets broken into, you'll be able to sort of ticket along the lines of threat and along the lines of response that I suggest that we need to work on. We need to elevate the public dialogue in America. You know, the news channels, they only show the news that people like. If we had a longer-term perspective, when they show you Kim Kardashian in the morning and say, here's the latest thing on Beyonce, and look at that gown she's wearing, and oh, there's Janet Jackson again. I remember, look, they're all nice people, and they're all making a good living off our interest in them. But there are a lot more things of lasting significance for America, and if we can educate ourselves to think about the long-term vision, the news media will follow what we believe is significant. I'm offering one way to frame it, and I hope you'll take it and read it. I've never written a book that I wanted read and discussed like this one. You can argue with every sentence in this book. Every sentence could have been a paragraph, every paragraph could have been a page, and it's just my experience, but I wrote it because I love this country, and I know we can be greater and more successful than we are. And I know if we are more powerful and stronger at home, the challenges that bedevil us abroad, we won't have to face the same way. And I look at in airports and I look at the faces of those men and women in uniform that I love. And I think about the 350,000 that are out there with PTSD in one form or another because we sent them there because we didn't understand. And I'm asking you to do everything you can to prevent us making another mistake in the heat of the moment, in the passion of fear. We need a long-term vision. Read this book, like it, adopt it, or argue with it, but help us lengthen our time perspective in America. It's not about the next election. It's about the next generation and the generation after that. I believe we've got the best system of government in the world. We're the only hope for human dignity and freedom and moving beyond the authoritarian nature of the state. But it rests on the power of the U.S. economy and the effectiveness of the U.S. political system. And if we lose it, shame on us.
Well, General Wesley Clark, thank you very much.
Thank you.